Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. For today's webinar, Jaelyn Peckman and Kate Preston will present about communication during crisis. Before I invite them to present, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open the chat, just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined by phone, then you can email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you happen to encounter any technical problems during today's webinar, then you can please let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. Fourth, we will make a webinar recording available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access that recording in about a day from now. You can also find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our division's YouTube page. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Communication During a Crisis, How to Protect Our Brand. Presenting on this topic are Jaelyn Peckman, who's an agricultural communications instructor at the University of Missouri, and Kate Preston, who's a graduate student of agricultural leadership, communication, and education. So thank you both for presenting today. Kate, if you could please start your video and unmute your microphone, then we can begin today's presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Alice. So our goals for today are to discuss foundational knowledge of crisis and people during crises, discover components of crisis and emergency risk communications, evaluate past organizational crises and communications, and gain practical tips for working with the media.
Good morning. Thank you, Alice and Kate. My name is Jaelyn Peckman, and just jumping into our first kind of topic of the day is that we a lot of times find ourselves being reactive when a crisis happens. We think, what do we need to do to communicate and fix this problem? But we need to shift our thinking to a proactive stance. And I kind of think of this model like a road trip. So if we can think of a road trip in terms of our daily work, we a lot of times go through the day, the mundane task of trying to get from point A to point B as quickly and most efficiently and with as few problems as possible, right? And usually we look like that little car that heads straight for our point B or our destination, and there's no hiccups in the road. But sometimes when a crisis happens and it occurs, this is what our daily life turns into. And we are backtracking and we're not sure how to respond and what to do, and we're stressed out and we look like that poor woman in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. But hopefully our time spent this morning can help you see crisis communications as a proactive stance, so that even when a crisis happens in your organization, we look like that road trip on the left side of the screen. There are a lot of different types of crises that can happen and impact our brand, but just to name a few, we can have natural disasters, organizational misdeeds, maybe in our leadership, or something happens large scale with our organizational brand, financial crises, technical error where something is harmed in our product, like a food recall, or there's violence in the workplace that takes to social media, and social media crises are something that we have to be aware of now that even 10 years ago we didn't have to worry about. Maybe somebody hijacking our social media account, how we would respond to that. But that's definitely an area of concern in this new media age. Rumors that can take to online, human error accidents, technology crisis, the list goes on and on. So it kind of brings us to this question of, is it possible to prepare for every crisis? And I think the answer is twofold. It's yes and no. In the past, crisis communication would encourage you to list every potential crisis and a blanketed response of what you would say if that crisis happened. But the truth is, we can't do that anymore, because crises are fluid and we need to see them as a flexible document. So I think that we do have some options of general practices of what we can apply that we need to be proactive, but we can't have a blanketed answer to plan for every response. The key is to be fluid. Here's a little bit about what we know about crises, and more specifically, what we know about people during crises. People want to search for the reason of a negative event. So attribution is really important to people when our emotions are high. We want to know what caused the event. And although perception is reality in our normal day, that's something we hear all of the time. Perception is even more reality whenever a crisis happens. Whether that rumor about the organization is true or not, if the public believes it to be true, that perception is what is going to stick with people. Everything we do during a crisis and whenever we aren't in a crisis, whether it's directly with our stakeholders or indirectly by word of mouth, that's going to affect our reputation of our company. So at the end of the day, when a crisis happens, our stakeholders, they're honestly looking to see, are we the hero or the villain of that story? And hopefully they see us as that Batman on the right side of the screen. Research shows that people's ability to process information reduces by up to 80% whenever we find ourselves in an emotionally charged situation. And so we want to make sure we can do anything that we can so that we don't look like the Joker whenever people's emotions are high. This is a really good resource if you're looking for a good book to put on your bookshelf and use to help you plan a crisis communications plan. A lot of what Kate and I are going to work through today came from this resource, and this is a really funny, yet my favorite quote in the whole book by Timothy Coombs. It says, "The best way to manage a crisis is to prevent one." And he's being a little bit funny because he also goes on to talk about how crises are unpredictable, but they're not unexpected. Meaning, we don't know when a crisis will happen, but we know that they will happen, and we've got to plan accordingly.
Okay, so responding to a crisis. There are a few steps that you should take when trying to respond to a crisis. So the first one is to alert and assemble a crisis management team. Every business should have a group of people or a person to be able to respond to the crisis. So alert and assemble a team. To collect all relevant information. It's really important to include what has happened, who was involved, where it took place, and the current state of a crisis. Third, you want to assign tasks and continue fact-finding throughout the crisis. So the CMT should delegate duties. That way not one single person is taking all the responsibility. Everyone needs to monitor during the crisis and make adjustments as needed. Obviously, things are going to change as this crisis evolves. And then lastly, and probably the most important, is to communicate with key stakeholders. So the biggest thing is to avoid silence. You never don't want to respond, and we'll get more into that later. And you want to respond quickly and decisively. And enhance compassion and believability is really important as well. So a spokesperson. It's really important to identify a single spokesperson or team now. That way you are prepared and you know who's going to deal with the situation when the time comes. So the voice of the organization, it's important to be accurate and consistent. It shows that you're credible, your organization is doing the steps to respond to this crisis. Listen and respond to media and stakeholders. Again, that kind of goes back to the not responding is never the answer. So it's important to still be active on media and communicate with stakeholders. So training. You want this person to be able to handle stress well, because obviously this job is not easy and is very stressful. So you want them to be able to handle stress, be sincere, articulate, and always think one step ahead because you never know what is going to happen. Have sound bites and key messages, and it is okay to admit what is not known. Crises, no one ever expects them, so it is okay to admit it that you don't know really what's going on. And also, while you want to respond in a quick manner, speed does increase risks and inaccuracies. So it is important to take that time and really think about how you're going to develop this message and what you want to relay to your audience. And a good example of this is the Bluebell ice cream case. They had a listeria outbreak back in 2015. And obviously, this was really big. And what they did really well is that they were transparent. They told their audience what they knew, facts. They showed empathy, and this is really important. Businesses should say, I apologize for this happening, in which they did that. And then lastly is they showed improvement. They were telling their audience the key steps they were taking to get past this crisis.
So this is kind of the meat and potatoes that we really want everyone to take away from this webinar this morning, is that if you don't have a crisis communications plan in place, these 5 steps from a crisis and emergency risk communication, or CERC plan, is your first go-to. And although this plan is not necessarily how to manage a crisis, it's specifically how to manage communications during a crisis. So as soon as you are aware that a crisis might happen, we're in this pre-crisis stage. And this is where a brand should be sharing risk messages, warnings, preparations. And the first one that comes to mind, we live in mid-Missouri, so we don't have hurricanes here all the time. But whenever Hurricane Harvey occurred, this was all over the news. Anytime a hurricane is about to hit the Midland, we see news reporters out there. And what are they sharing? They're sharing evacuation messages, what anybody can do to change their behavior and decrease harm. So obviously, we can't always anticipate a crisis. If we could, it would be really good to always be in this pre-crisis stage. But sometimes we find our brand in the initial event. We had no idea that a crisis was about to occur, and it's happened. Maybe our social media has gotten hijacked. We skip the pre-crisis stage, and our messaging goes straight into reducing uncertainty and making sure that we're reassuring our audience. Kate touched on the key here is that we've got to show empathy. We've got to show reassurance, and we should be letting our spokesperson, the person that's associated with our brand, share that message. And I don't know about you all, but mid-March, my email was overflowed by brands that I follow and interact with. They were all sharing what their company is doing, what their brand is doing to work through COVID-19 outbreak. And although it may have felt a little overwhelming, it was really important for all of those brands to get their message out there. So this is just a screenshot from Bed Bath & Beyond of an email I got. And if you are able to quickly skim it, you'll find that they are empathetic. They're apologizing for what's happening. They're saying, we feel you, we hear you. But then they also shift their messaging to show what they're doing right now to increase the cleanliness of their stores so that people can still have a safe shopping experience. After that initial event, we'll find ourselves in this maintenance section. And this section, the length is really dependent on how long that crisis occurs. Every crisis has a life cycle. So if it's a short life cycle, we'll move rather quickly through the maintenance stage. Right now in COVID-19, this life cycle seems that it's very long. So all of the brands that we're interacting with online, they're definitely in this maintenance lifestyle. We are still reducing uncertainty and sharing messages to give reassurance. But what changes here is that since we're past the initial event, it's really important that we use our user-generated content to get feedback from the public, and we answer the questions that the public are actually asking. So this last summer, Fair Oaks Farms in Indiana found themselves in a crisis when a video showing employees having animal abuse on their farm leaked on the internet. But the CEO of this company up here in the picture on the left side of the screen did a phenomenal job with maintenance communication, and I was amazed. He put a statement video out that listened to all of the questions people were asking, and he answered their concerns in a video. And the piece that stuck out to me most is that he shared the employees documented of doing animal abuse. They had been fired 3 months before the video showing the abuse aired on the internet. So it made me, as a stakeholder in that group and a consumer of their brand, it made me realize that they had a plan in place. That plan worked. And so this is a really good way to give feedback into the public and show that what we're doing is working. They just need to maintain that communication. So that's a really good case study if you ever want to look into Fair Oaks Farms. They did a phenomenal job in their crisis communications. So once we are finally through that crisis, we can't really look at the end of the light until we get through this resolution stage. So our messaging is going to shift from maintaining, we still need to reduce uncertainty and show reassurance, but we're able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so we can really share with our viewers or our followers more of what we know about the root cause of this crisis, if there's any new risks that have surfaced, and most importantly, to show that improvement piece that Kate mentioned with Bluebell ice cream, what our next steps are. This is where we have recovery and rebuilding efforts. We need to reinforce the positive side of our brand to have that positive corporate identity and image restored. Chipotle Mexican Grill has had a few E. coli outbreaks and food recalls over the past few years, but they always do a pretty good job of updating the public on what they're doing to change their HACCP protocol or their hazard and analysis critical control point plan, so that they're telling their viewers, we're not just going to keep doing what we've always been doing. We noticed we had an E. coli problem. Here's what we're doing to fix it. So once you're past that maintenance communication, you see the light at the end of the tunnel, our messaging really has to shift to what our next steps are. Then the last step is the evaluation messaging. And honestly, the public really doesn't get to see this because it happens internal, and it should happen internal. This is where we're going to look at our team and say what worked with our crisis communications, what didn't work, and what can we learn from it so we don't make the same mistakes in the future. Two keys that are really important in this stage: you have to do it as a group. And sometimes we can think of reflecting on an event, whether it's crisis or not, as talking with a coworker in the hallway about what went well. But the problem is, if we just rely on reflecting in the hallway with a coworker, we don't usually write those things down. We don't have the group think. So it's really important to work through this evaluation stage in a group, but actually document what worked well and go ahead and put into place the actions that you think your brand needs to change for the future so that you don't have those same issues occur in another crisis.
Just so another example, which is super interesting to me, I'm sure you all remember there was an E. coli outbreak in 2018 through romaine lettuce. And this case was very tricky, which I'll get into, but on April 4th, the FDA and the CDC began an investigation because in Arizona and California, there was a large outbreak in E. coli. So eventually, after several tests, they started testing fields, different water, and as well as processing plants for lettuce in both California and Arizona. And they ended up tracing it back to E. coli into romaine lettuce. And what was really difficult is that they never traced it back to one single farm. But what they found is that in 36 different fields and 23 different farms in Yuma County, Arizona, is actually where the source began. This investigation was by far it was not easy, considering they were dealing with two different states. And what they ended up finding is that there was a water source that these 23 farms in Arizona used that was contaminated, and they watered their fields with that irrigation, with that canal. So how did they deal with this? Like I said, it wasn't one specific company or one specific farm. So the CDC and the FDA really had to take it into their own hands. So on their websites, they posted signs and symptoms of E. coli. They also had a link to report cases, which is how they really narrowed it down to Yuma County, Arizona, is people were increasingly kept getting these cases, so they would report it on the website. They also did daily updates on the CDC website, again, just kind of reiterating, this is what we're doing to solve this. Here are some tips, things like that. In the beginning, they ended up writing a letter to California and Arizona's Department of Ag, just kind of stating, we think this is the source. We can't really find it yet, but here are some protocols you should take. And then lastly, as you can see, there's a couple snippets from national papers. So like the New York Times, this was in the beginning. It said that lettuce expands to 16 states. It actually ended up infecting 36 states in total, which is pretty big. And I know I personally remember going to the grocery store or to different restaurants. They had signs in their stores saying that they don't have romaine lettuce at this time because of this outbreak.
And I know that we are coming up on our time because it's 10:20 and we want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So we're just going to leave this slide with some best practices up on the screen. And Alice, we'll turn it over to you for questions.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. And if you do have a question for Kate and Jaelyn, then please go ahead and submit in the comment or chat screen. And then you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. While we're waiting on some questions, I have one of my own. This week I saw some research from GfK, which is the market research firm, and it had surveyed US consumers recently and found that nearly 3/4 of those US consumers thought that companies were trying to take advantage of the crisis. And so what are your recommendations for how brands can change their messaging to reverse or avoid these sorts of sentiments, which could have long-term impacts if consumers don't want to purchase from those brands in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a big fear right now, especially whenever our emotions are high. And like the statistics showed, 80% of our information processing kind of goes out the window when we are in an emotionally charged state. So my guess is that overall, some of those brands that people feel like they are being taken advantage of, they aren't sharing enough empathy. They're not saying we hear you. And I think part of the nature of COVID-19 is that it's going so long. Brands often feel like every consumer will read every piece of information that they put out there. So if they show empathy once, they believe that every viewer is reading that message, but that's not true. And brands often underestimate how many times we need to reinforce and revisit the same message, those key messages time after time. So my tip, and I'm going to turn it over to Kate, would be they need to have some more empathy and just realize that we're still in that maintenance stage. It's just taking a long time.
Yeah, I agree. Like we discussed, I think it's just really important just to keep telling the consumers, hey, we are here for you, but these are the steps that we're doing. And so I think, like Jaelyn said, that empathy piece is really important.
Great. Thank you for that. Another question here is that employees are key stakeholders for a brand. So what are some strategies for including employees in that crisis communications plan to ensure that they have the information they need to do their jobs, and then also have the information that they can share with some of their contacts who are also key stakeholders for the business to ensure that they have the information that they need to interact with the company?
There is this concept called a CMP, Crisis Management Plan. And Kate and I didn't get into that today because we really wanted to focus on the communications side. However, if you are interested, that book that I put up by Timothy Coombs, he walks through the components of a CMP. And part of that is what type of documents do our employees need from us? And one of the pieces is a key statement. Like what do we want our employees sharing about our brand, key statements, but that will be very fluid and different for each situation. The second piece I would add to, in addition to a CMP, is that the size of the company is different for how we communicate with our employees. If we're a large scale company, it can take some time for that messaging to trickle down, but it's really important that messaging is clear and it is consistent. If we're a small company, we still need to be careful. We don't want to speed up our communication with our employees and say something that's inaccurate. So the key is to be consistent and swift in our communication with our employees, but also a lot of times employees just want to be heard. So if you can have some time just to listen to what your employees are asking, you can handle those questions on a one-on-one basis.
Excellent. So you mentioned that the importance of a brand or a company having a crisis management or response team. Who should be involved in that team in terms of designing the key messages and determining the approach that should be taken during a crisis?
I've actually got some notes jotted down because it is really important of who you have on your team. So I'm going to throw out some people, and then Kate, who I'm missing, I want you to add some people in, but you for sure need a leader of that organization, whether it's the owner of the company or that CEO, whoever has that company's vision, they know that like the back of their hand. You also need to have some administrative support on that crisis management team, someone that can help you know what we need to be doing and actually get the job done. Send the emails to people, like the day-to-day task. You need the administrative support. Human resources, the people that work with technology, whoever's managing your social media. It's really important to have public relations professionals and communication specialists on your team. And if that's one person, maybe it is working with other brands to figure out how you can collaborate and what other brands are doing and who's on their CMT to help you get through that crisis. The final person is you have to have a subject matter aid. If it's a food recall, you need whoever is looking at your HACCP plan. If it is a social media hijacking, you need that social media analyst on that. That last piece will be fluid based on what the situation is.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see, a question here is about, for authenticity purposes, do you have recommendations for fostering voices outside the company to lend support in protecting the brand's reputation?
Kate, do you have thoughts?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So I think that authenticity, just say the question one more time, Alice, so I understand.
I think it's getting at, can you engage brand ambassadors, people outside the company, to help to speak on your firm's behalf, or, you know, share messages on your firm's behalf?
So to be honest, there's actually a thought that we want to decrease spokespeople that are not on your CMT. And the thought is that they don't have that training. So although a brand ambassador would be a really good idea because you can have more hands and feet out in the public, they can reach more people. What they need to be, if you have people that want to do that, that is great. What you need to do is have them share the content that your crisis management team is creating. That way that message is consistent. So just to protect the authenticity of your brand, everything needs to be rooted from that one central group or person that's a spokesperson, but use those ambassadors to share the message farther.
Great, thank you. Is it valuable for a company to run crisis simulations, similar to a fire drill, for instance, to make sure that all of the components are in place for when an actual crisis does occur?
I can take that one. Yeah, I think it is important. I mean, like we discussed, every crisis is different, and you aren't going to respond to it the same way every single time. But I think it is important to kind of have a skeleton of this is how we're going to deal with media, and these are the people that are going to deal with either journalists or things like that. So I think just having a kind of a skeleton that you can apply to each individual crisis to help make that message, I think, is really important. That way you're not just going into it completely wild and free and not really having a plan. So I think it is definitely important.
Great. I have a similar kind of follow-up question there. Does the response to a crisis look different if the crisis is firm specific, for example, a food safety issue for that firm, versus if it's a crisis that affects the economy more broadly, like the one we're experiencing now with the coronavirus pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I think it comes down to that perception or the attribution on who caused, what the root cause is. And if it's something your company has done, owning up to that and being transparent and open is the best practice, and having very short, brief key messages with the public. If it's the world we're living in today, to where it's something completely out of our control, then there's really no way to work through simulation activities on a regular basis. Those should be considered, but it's a little harder to plan for something like we're in right now. So definitely the nature of what causes a crisis, if it's our brand that has caused it, and that's not always, that doesn't always, sometimes it's not our fault, like accidents just happen, but the way we handle those types of crises versus things that naturally occur, they definitely impact how we handle the crisis and if we can practice and what our messaging is.
Right. One final question here. Do you have any thoughts or ideas about how producers can message right now, food producers, that is, farmers, about how they're contributing to the food system at this time?
So I can speak from a personal experience. I know a dairy farmer at home, and she went to the grocery store, had a discussion with the cashier, and he was talking to her about how they're putting limits on families buying milk, things like that. And he thought that there just wasn't enough milk. well, she started to talk with him. Farmers are dumping milk, things like that. So she actually put on her own Facebook page, she made a video just kind of explaining what's going on with the industry and the steps people can take to try to buy directly from the farmer. So I think that was really important, and I know it got a lot more attention than she really expected. So I think really just communicating for the farmer on a personal level of, this is what we're doing and here are the things that you can do, are really important with that.
I would add that right now people are thinking about food and food production more than normal. And we can use that to not necessarily our advantage, but kind of think of it as our time to be in the limelight. But what's really important as producers start to advocate for ag, which we need to be doing, but we have to always do it in a positive way. And like Kate mentioned, there's that misconception, the example of they just thought there wasn't enough milk. So people just honestly don't know what's going on in ag right now, except for the producers that are out there day in and day out producing and working hard from sun up to sundown. But the key is to never put down those inaccuracies or never share the negative context that can come along with maybe someone not understanding why we do what we do, because that turns people off. So it's always being positive, taking those misconceptions as an opportunity to teach somebody in a positive way will go a lot longer.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for presenting today. And thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a webinar recording from Zoom in about a day from now, so look for that via email. We'll resume the Engaging for Missouri webinar series on Wednesday of next week. At that time, Dr. Mark White will present about common workforce challenges identified in the Missouri Food, Agriculture, and Forestry Workforce Needs Assessment. So registration information for next week's webinars will be distributed later today. So again, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great weekend.